Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Hercules Mulligan, who recently became famous from a little known Broadway musical called Hamilton. Now, Mulligan's story, as with most stories and works of art of that nature, well, a little bit of it is embellished, and some of it is just altered enough, and we're going to set as much of the story straight today as we possibly can. Now, Hercules Mulligan was living in New York City as things got a little bit sticky with the American Revolution, and Mulligan was a tailor. He did go to college, King's College, and had studied under his father to learn accounting, but he decides to become a tailor, which is a little bit of a surprising choice. Being an artisan was kind of a step down from running a merchant firm at the time, but he makes this choice and he's really good at it. He makes a whole lot of money, and once the taxes start rolling in, Mulligan is not happy. See, all of these taxes that come through, they affect the price of fabric. Now, interesting side note, Hercules Mulligan did make some of his own fabric, but he also imported a lot of fabric, and therefore it made his prices go up. It affected his customers, yada, yada, yada. This guy's not happy. Now, Mulligan actually joins the New York Sons of Liberty. Yes, Boston is not the only place with Sons of Liberty. New York had Sons of Liberty as well. And joining the Sons of Liberty, he actually participates in the Battle of Golden Hill, which was an outbreak of violence. It's hard to call it a battle, more of a pushing, shoving match between colonists and certain British soldiers, but he was involved in that shoving match. And then as the years go by, as the revolution gets more intense, well, a young man comes into his life, and this is where things are a little different than the musical. See, in the musical, they imply that Hamilton and Mulligan are the same age. They're not. Hamilton comes to America as a teenager, and at this point, Mulligan's already in his mid-30s with several children and a family, and he is introduced through Hercules' brother Hugh, introduces Hamilton, and Hercules Mulligan helps set Hamilton up in Princeton. Now, I do want to note, Mulligan was also already familiar with the Kruger family in St. Croix, who were the ones who sponsored Hamilton to come to North America, to the continent, to get his education. Mulligan sets him up with William Livingston, another future founder, where Hamilton lives for a little bit, but the play does get it right that Hamilton wants to have a little bit of a accelerated curriculum, and, well, Princeton won't have it. So Hamilton transfers to King's College back in New York City, and he actually lives with Mulligan as a Mulligan becomes his landlord, essentially, as a tenant. Hamilton is living with this much older gentleman. He's about 20 years his senior, and Hercules Mulligan actually is credited for, in large part, for helping Hamilton decide to push harder for revolution. When he first came over, Hamilton, as we would learn later in life, was very pro-empire, on the border of being pro-British government, even at the Constitutional Convention. So he shows up with this attitude as a teenager, but Mulligan helps steer him towards the revolutionary cause. And in fact, the two work together when they take the battery, as mentioned in the play. They take the battery and steal several cannons. Let's go steal their cannons. They do that. They steal several cannons from the British in New York. And in fact, there's an interesting letter from Mulligan noting that Mulligan is pulling a cannon and he's not doing a very good job. And Hamilton walks up and says, "Here, hold my gun," which Mulligan does. And then Hamilton helps carry the cannon away. Now, Mulligan, being a terrible friend for the moment, puts down Hamilton's gun and leaves. Not long thereafter, Hamilton actually shows up and says, "Mulligan, where's my gun?" And Hercules says, "Oh, I left it back there." And Hamilton then turns towards the gunfire and stoically walks back to retrieve his pistol. That's one of the most fun stories from Hercules Mulligan and Hamilton that I know of. It does show that Hamilton was certainly brave, if not kind of stupid at the time, and Mulligan a little bit forgetful, considering, again, he was supposed to be the grown-up in this situation. Now, once the British come into New York City, the Patriots evacuate, but Mulligan stays and mans his tailor shop. Now, there's not a lot of good explanations I've come across for how this works out, because he was literally fighting against and stealing from the British Army just months before this happened. Now, it may be that the British didn't realize the level of his involvement. I mean, the fighting was from cannons across the water. But it also may be that the British really wanted people to just come back and be good Brits again. So when Mulligan said, hey, I'm sorry about all that, I'm just going to go back to being a tailor, the British officer said, oh, okay, just keep your nose out of trouble. And this is important because he ends up being a tailor for British officers, for really important senior British officers, because he was the best tailor in town, so he got the highest class clientele. The way this becomes really important, as they mention in the play, once George Washington realizes he needs to establish a better intelligence gathering system, especially in New York City, well, he's at that point brought Hamilton into his circle, and Alexander Hamilton says, hey, I know Hercules Mulligan is a patriot. He might be over there parading around as a loyalist, but I know he is my mentor as a revolutionary. He will be down to help us out. And because of this, Hamilton does contact Mulligan on behalf of Washington, and Mulligan does start tailoring intelligence, as I like to say, for the Continental Army. And in fact, most of what he gathers are troop numbers and movements and strategic things of that nature. Because, again, he is tailoring the clothing. He's taking measurements of senior British officers while these guys are just chatting in front of him, not thinking twice about it. And they get a ton of information back to Washington. And in fact, Mulligan is credited with saving George Washington's life on at least one, if not two occasions. Now, the one occasion that most people are more familiar with is apparently a gentleman named Thomas Hickey was leading a little bit of a espionage unit. He had infiltrated the American army and was trying to assassinate Washington. And fortunately, Mulligan was able to get information to Washington quick enough that they changed the commander-in-chief's location and the trouble was averted. So this goes on for a few years, this whole being a spy thing, until a guy named Benedict Arnold comes into the picture. Yeah, that Benedict Arnold. And Benedict Arnold commits treason. We know this. But what we don't all know is that once Benedict Arnold commits treason, he goes over and fights with the British. He actually invades, he leads attacks against Americans on several occasions. And he goes over and he says, hey, British officers, you know this guy Hercules Mulligan that you've been just talking in front of while he takes your measurements? He's been telling all that information to the Continental Army. To which the British go, oh yeah, he was one of the Sons of Liberty, wasn't he? He's not necessarily the most trustworthy character in New York City. So they confront Mulligan on this. And Mulligan goes, what are you talking about? Now, Mulligan was a very fast talker. He was persuasive. He was charming. He could convince you that he was not selling your secrets to the enemy. Now, he did this in a very interesting way. He said, how could I possibly have been over there? I was here with you guys the whole time. How could I have been in two places at once? Oh, you're telling me Benedict Arnold's the one who told you I'm you're going to trust Benedict Arnold. Because the thing is, even though Benedict Arnold committed treason to help the British, someone who commits treason is not necessarily the most trustworthy character, even if you're the one he was helping out. So, because of this, the British go, okay, Hercules, you're cool, and kind of forget the whole thing. But the question is, how was he able to be in two places at once? Well, Hercules Mulligan had a servant, by which I mean an enslaved person named Cato. Now, Cato was, to my understanding, the Mulligan family's only slave, and Cato was slavery in much of the North, New England, and good portions of New York City were much different than what we often think of in the South with plantations and that nature. Most families who had a servant, as they called them at the time, would have one, maybe two or three, if you're really wealthy, slaves in your house. And they were treated, unfortunately, the way women were treated, which was like children, but members of the family, to be taken care of in that nature. So Mulligan did seem to have a closer relationship with Cato than we would usually associate a master and a slave actually having. Because of this, Cato does help Mulligan. And in fact, that's how Mulligan's in two places at once, because they would use Cato's position in society as a slave to deliver messages, and he would not be really interrogated or investigated too heavily by the British, thinking that a slave, again, Sadly, not how I view people, but at the time they said, well, it's just a slave. He couldn't know that much. What could he really be doing? So they would just let Cato pass. He'd go deliver the messages, save Washington's life, help the Continental Army win the war, and return. And I do plan on doing a whole entire video on Cato himself coming up very soon. So I will, but I don't want to leave him out of this because he's integral to Hercules Mulligan's work as a espionage agent for the Continental Army. That being said, I should side note that Cato is freed later in life, and then we don't know a lot about him, but Hercules Mulligan does join Hamilton and John Jay and 19 other people to be a founding member of the New York Manumission Society, and although he doesn't later in life participate that much in public life, the one thing he does in public life really is contribute to the Manumission Society, which does eventually instigate gradual emancipation of slaves in New York. So before we get too mad at him for making his slave do all the work, we want to keep that in mind, that their relationship was different than we would usually view relationships in hindsight of this nature. Though, of course, not apologizing for slavery, never my intention. Anyway, Mulligan has saved Washington's life a few times. He skirted getting caught by Benedict Arnold, of all people, and then the Revolutionary War ends. And the Patriots re-enter New York City. The British evacuate, and the Patriots re-enter New York City. And Hercules Mulligan is over here, having been real chummy with British officers for quite a while. And George Washington knows this. And George Washington also knows what an asset Hercules Mulligan actually was to the outcome of the war. So, the second day George Washington is in New York City, one of the first people he dines with, aka eats a meal with, is Hercules Mulligan. And this is for two reasons. First of all, it's a thank you from the Commander-in-Chief for your service to your country. Second of all, and much more importantly for Hercules Mulligan, it was a demonstration to the entire city, hey, this guy was on our side the whole time. We don't want any vigilantes out there trying to take his stuff or hurt his family when he most assuredly does not deserve that treatment. After this, Hercules Mulligan leaves public life. As I said, he does join the Manumission Society, but other than that, he doesn't hold any office. He doesn't seem to want to be involved in politics. He just wants to cut his fabric and stitch it up. And the only other super fun fact that I found real deep in my digging about Hercules Mulligan is years later, once George Washington becomes President Washington, well, President Washington wants a certain pair of breeches that he just can't get his hands on. And breeches are basically pants. And he reaches out to Hercules Mulligan, who sends him, free of charge, the pair of pants that President Washington so desperately wanted. So that is the story, in very brief, of Hercules Mulligan. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it cleared up some of the misconceptions from the Broadway play, which gets a surprising amount right, to be fair, about Hercules Mulligan. If you did enjoy this video, definitely hit like. And if you're new here, subscribe. I talk about the American Revolution, usually not quite so famous people, 7 days a week. So I'll be back with another Founder for You tomorrow.